As funny as this seems today, this was probably the most controversial thing ever included in a John Madden football game. That's right, the ambulance runs over the other players as it gets an injured player from the field. And you can only find it on John Madden Football 1992 on the Genesis. Well, it only existed for a single version of the game. It was gone by 1993, and yet its legacy has managed to live on for years and years, largely because of the controversy at the time surrounding violence in video games. So let's take a closer look. As you already know, the first John Madden Football game for the Genesis was a big success. While the gameplay is a bit slow, this was an extremely good game for 1990, a real step up. The first Madden really was a big deal and was like nothing else out there at the time. And it was a major hit game for a console that really needed a hit. Now, when the time came to make the sequel, EA was in a pretty precarious situation. EA needed to keep everything that made the first game so popular in place, and still needed to figure out a way to make improvements. And EA succeeded, sort of. Madden 92 on the Genesis is a little bit faster than the original. You still have to wait for players to get on and off the field, which is still annoying. However, you don't have to wait quite as long. Play calling has been expanded. You actually can call the 3-4 defense, for example. In the original, the 3-4 was strangely missing, probably just an oversight by the programmers. But most things were the same in the sequel. There still was no actual season mode, for example. You can only play a one-off game just like in the original. Now, the original game did have a playoff feature, though you had to play all the games at once. The 1992 version had a password system that allowed you to continue your playoffs if you like. But by and large, it was a case of simply not needing to fix things that weren't broke. In fact, in many ways, Madden 1992 was mostly just a roster update. That's similar to the way EA Sports has treated its big franchise in recent years. However, another major change was the development of a version on the Super Nintendo. That's something that must have made the people at Sega pretty upset. Now, the confusing thing here is that the Super Nintendo game was just called John Madden Football with no year. But this is clearly Madden 1992, not the first game. And as far as the gameplay is concerned, well, just look at it. Everything is choppy and the frame rate is really bad. This is one of the worst versions of John Madden Football ever released. In fact, I think this game is borderline unplayable. I couldn't get through an entire quarter before I turned it off in frustration. Well, I wondered if this was an emulation problem at first, but then I found other videos of this game on YouTube and realized that everybody has the same issue. I also wondered if it was something hardware related, and so I looked at Madden 93 as well. And well, Madden 93 on the Super Nintendo suffers from the same issues. It's not as obvious, but this is also a pretty poorly designed game. Now, I don't know the reason why the early Super Nintendo Madden games were so choppy and just bad. I suspect, however, that the team at EA didn't know what tricks they could use to get the Super Nintendo versions to feel more smooth. And Madden is not the only Super Nintendo game that suffered. Well, take NBA Jam on the Super NES, for example. That's a game that came out in early 1994, years after the first Madden game. It's not an awful game, but it feels kind of primitive. The Genesis version is clearly superior. And the same is true of NBA Jam Tournament Edition. The Super Nintendo version just feels off. The Genesis might have technically had weaker graphic capabilities, but the Genesis port is simply superior. And the play control, which you can't really see in a video, is much better on the Sega. Stuff like this is the reason why the Genesis built up a reputation in the 1990s of being the best system for sports games. The Madden series and Super Nintendo did catch up by the mid-1990s, sure, but by that time most serious football fans already owned a Genesis. Reputation really makes a big difference. However, if you were reading the major video game magazines of the time, you wouldn't know the difference. GamePro, for example, gave John Madden Football 92 a tremendous rating. This is back when GamePro's rating system was nothing but these faces, and look at how happy they are. The Super Nintendo version also received rave reviews. You would think that the graphics and gameplay in this version were stellar. In fact, you really had to look closely to realize that there were issues with the animation, the scrolling, and the frame rate. Now, if you're curious, that same December 1991 issue of GamePro reviewed Tecmo Super Bowl on the NES. Incredibly, it gave that game worse ratings, though I think anybody can agree that NES Tecmo Super Bowl is light years ahead of the first Super Nintendo Madden game. So is it possible that EA was, buying reviews? I would say that is likely. If you follow the Madden series from the beginning to the present day, you will notice a pattern of reviewers skipping over obvious and glaring issues inside the games. People have defaulted to calling this the greatest football game ever right from the beginning, which is more than a little bit suspicious. Larry Flint's Video Games and Computer Entertainment, for example, called it the greatest action-oriented electronic pigskin simulation ever produced. In January 1992, Larry Flint's magazine reviewed the Super Nintendo version, but apparently not the Genesis version, which is really weird. This might look like a comprehensive review, but there's no mention anywhere of the Genesis version or of the obvious animation problems with the Super Nintendo game. Electronic Gaming Monthly, meanwhile, didn't bother to give anybody scores for anything. The Genesis version highlighted the new intro screens, which honestly are really useless. And again, there was no mention of the slowdown and animation issues anywhere in the brief review of the Super NES game. Instead, readers only got a bunch of screenshots. So believe it or not, only Nintendo Power gave the Super Nintendo clunker an actually honest review. That should be surprising, since Nintendo Power was basically a glorified advertisement for Nintendo in those days. But its honesty is the reason why so many of us read nothing but Nintendo Power back when we were kids. Now there's one other thing missing in all these reviews of Madden 1992. The thing that is missing is any mention of the ambulance. Isn't it interesting that none of the major video game magazines even mentioned the fact that an ambulance would come and knock over players on the field? Now, if you look closely, you can find the ambulance mentioned in the official advertisements for the game. The only mention here is about the so-called quarterback sneak to the hospital. Quite a few daily newspapers around the United States ran this small article in a section for kids. Here they talk about the ambulance taking your quarterback away for x-rays if you get sacked too often. But that was pretty much it. The ambulance was still there in Madden 1993 and in the later games, but in those games they had the players get out of the way. However, the controversy did not die out. Electronic Gaming Monthly reprinted this Phil Mushnick article in April 1993. Now, the original article was printed in the New York Post back in January 1993. Mushnick complains about the violence in video games, noting specifically violent language on the packaging of the Genesis version of John Madden Football 1992. The front of the package looks innocuous, of course. The back also doesn't strike me as particularly violent. Mushnick's concern was with this sentence here, crush the quarterback, knock him out of the game. And he was also concerned about this part here, the quarterback sneak to the hospital. But of course that wasn't all. Mushnick also somehow found out about that somewhat rare ambulance issue. Mushnick notes that the fact that the ambulance ran over players that stood in the way. He then wondered if young fans watching the Bills-Steelers playoff game on January 9, 1993 were disappointed that the ambulance that took John Jackson off the field didn't mow over any players on the way. So that came because of this play right here. Now, I do get his point, kind of, and in Mushnick's defense, I will say that he also took the NFL to task for glorifying violence. That came from this mention of an NFL Rocks video by NFL Films. I'm pretty sure that refers to this videotape, NFL Rocks Extreme Football, which came out in late 1993. Now the video is filled with all sorts of illegal hits, something that the NFL today probably wouldn't glorify in a special home video release. Now normally this sort of thing would be a pretty minor point. The problem though is that this came at a time when the video game violence was increasingly coming under political scrutiny, and I think that's probably the reason why Mushnick wrote his article. Naturally, Electronic Gaming Monthly lambasted Mushnick's article after reprinting it. However, the Madden ambulance was only part of a growing concerning trend. Midway's infamous 1992 game Mortal Kombat drew the attention of US senators. Joe Lieberman, an independent, headed up a campaign to do serious research into video game violence. He was accompanied by Herbert Cole, a Democrat from Wisconsin. Now, in September 1993, Sega tried to head off the political winds by voluntarily coming up with its own rating system. This was the Video Game Rating Systems Council. The system itself wound up being pretty controversial among video game consumers, some of whom felt that the industry had no place telling parents what decisions they should make for their kids. Nintendo's decision that fall to take the blood out of the Super Nintendo port of Mortal Kombat was met with derision and controversy, and the game didn't sell very well at all. And Larry Flint's Video Games magazine made it all too clear where it stood on the issue after printing this provocative photo in the October 1993 edition. In the end, the congressional efforts led to the establishment of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board and its rating system. Of course, there was really nothing in place to prevent kids from buying games filled with blood and gore, nor is there anything really in place today. But it is interesting to note that a Madden game, of all games, helped start a lot of this furor and controversy. Now, there are two other things to note really quickly. So first of all, I should tell you that Video Games and Computer Entertainment did comment on how awful the first two Super Nintendo Madden games were. It also noted that the programming teams removed frames from the animations to try to make the games as fast as the Genesis versions, and that they failed, of course. But then again, the same magazine conveniently forgot to mention any of that in the actual reviews of the games when they first came out. The second thing is this report of a Madden football game for the NES, something that has never emerged even in demo form. So people have speculated about this over the years, such as this really old post on the old Atari Age forums. Posts like this one, however, are clearly incorrect since the first screenshots in magazines actually popped up in December 1991, and they indicate that the game was indeed being manufactured by EA. The only screenshots we have at all are these really small ones from Unseen 64, and I'm not sure where these originally come from. And honestly, it's probably better that EA skipped the NES. No matter what it did with Madden, it would never have been able to touch Tecmo Super Bowl. And there's the story behind the amulets in Madden 1992. So what was probably intended to be a joke wound up playing a minor role, at least, in the controversy over video game violence. And the crazy thing is that in hindsight, it really looks like much ado about nothing.